Samuel Briggs lived on the edge of the plains where the land seemed endless, stretching out in golden waves under a sky too large for any one man. The cattle that grazed his fields were his only company most days, and even they barely drew words from his lips. Silence had become his closest companion, not because he loved it, but because it was all he had left. He had buried his little boy on a rainy spring morning, the earth swallowing the sound of his wife's cries. Within a year, he buried her too, her body wasting away under grief too heavy for her small frame. Since then, Samuel had learned to stop asking questions of God or fate. He rose with the sun, worked until his hands bled, and let the night swallow him whole. He did not hope for more. That evening, the sky glowed with the last fire of day, the horizon painted in streaks of orange and crimson. Samuel was bent over a splintered fence post, his calloused fingers steady as he hammered a nail into place. The rhythm of the work was a comfort. The sound of the hammer against wood echoed across the still fields until another sound broke the pattern, the clatter of hooves and the rickety groan of wagon wheels. Samuel paused, straightening, squinting into the distance. The road beyond his land was usually empty at this hour, but now a cart rattled toward him, driven by two men whose shapes were little more than shadows in the fading light. Their hats were pulled low, their shoulders hunched, as if they wanted the world to pass them by unnoticed. He watched without moving, suspicion already curling in his gut. The wagon didn't slow as it drew close. Instead, with a sudden jolt, something heavy tumbled from the back and struck the dirt road with a muffled thud. The drivers didn't stop. They snapped the reins, urging their horses faster, and within moments they were only a cloud of dust retreating into the horizon. Samuel's eyes stayed fixed on the object lying in the middle of the road. At first glance, it looked like a sack of feed, lumpy and shapeless, tied with rope at the top. But as he watched, it shifted, just a faint movement, like something struggling inside. His pulse quickened. He told himself to walk away. Life had taught him that other people's business only ever brought trouble, and trouble was the last thing he wanted. Still, he found himself stepping toward it, his boots crunching against gravel, his heart beating harder with every step. By the time he stood over the sack, his chest felt tight. He leaned down slowly, listening. For a moment, there was nothing but the whisper of the wind across the grass. Then, clear as a whisper in his ear, a voice broke the silence. "Please, open it." His hands trembled in a way they hadn't since the day he lowered his boy's small coffin into the ground. He stared at the rough burlap, his throat dry. Again the voice came, weaker this time, gasping. "Please." He dropped the hammer he'd still been holding. The tool clattered against the dirt, and in a rush of urgency, he knelt, his fingers fumbling at the rope. The knot was cruelly tight, the coarse fibers digging into his skin as he tugged. His breath came fast, and at last, with a sharp jerk, the knot gave way. Samuel peeled back the folds of the sack, and what he saw stole the air from his lungs. A young woman lay inside, curled against herself like a discarded doll. Her hair clung to her face in sweaty strands, her lips cracked and dry, her skin pale with exhaustion. Purple bruises bloomed along the edge of her jaw, and her wrists were bound so tight the skin was rubbed raw. Her eyes fluttered open at the sudden air and light, wide and filled with both terror and relief. She coughed violently, dragging in ragged gulps of breath, and Samuel could see she was barely holding onto consciousness. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice rough but softer than it had been in years. He reached for the pocketknife on his belt, the blade flashing in the dying light as he cut the ropes around her wrists. The instant she was free, her hands shot out, clutching at the front of his shirt with a strength born of desperation. Her whole body shook, her eyes darting wildly toward the horizon where the wagon had disappeared. "They'll come back," she whispered, her voice hoarse and cracked. "You can't let them take me back. Please, don't let them." Samuel felt a wave of heat rise through him, a rage so fierce it startled him. Stuffed her into a sack like she was nothing, just a burden to be thrown away. He wanted to curse, to roar into the empty plains, but he kept his voice steady for her sake. "They're gone," he said firmly. "You're safe now." Her grip tightened, as if she didn't believe him. Samuel glanced back toward the dust cloud now long faded into the twilight. Every instinct told him danger still lurked out there, but when he looked down at her, this fragile creature half broken yet still clinging to life, he knew walking away was no longer an option. He could not leave her. Not after hearing that voice. Not after remembering the countless nights he had begged silently for someone to open the sack of grief that had smothered him. Carefully, he slid his arms beneath her, lifting her against his chest. She was lighter than he expected, her body trembling with the effort of simply breathing. She buried her face against his shoulder, and for the first time in years, Samuel felt another's heartbeat thudding against his own. His boots carried them across the field, each step deliberate as the twilight deepened. By the time he reached the door of his cabin, the stars had begun to pierce the velvet sky. He pushed it open with his shoulder, the smell of wood smoke and earth greeting him. Inside, the fire still smoldered in the stove, casting a glow over the room that had known only silence for too long. He laid her gently on the worn couch, tucking a blanket around her trembling form. As he straightened, Samuel looked down at her face in the flickering light. She was alive, but she was more than that. She was a question he hadn't been ready to ask. Who was she? What horrors had she escaped? And why had fate dropped her here, on his land, into his hands? He didn't know the answers yet. All he knew was this: by untying that sack, he had unbound more than just a stranger. He had unbound his own heart, whether he wanted it or not. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke and pine, the fire in the stove throwing out a soft glow that filled the room with shadows. Eliza sat wrapped in the blanket he had given her, her hands trembling as she held the mug of water. She sipped in small, careful gulps, as though she was afraid too much at once might choke her. Samuel sat opposite her at the table, elbows braced on the scarred wood, watching her with the cautious patience of a man who had lived too long with silence. He didn't ask questions immediately. He knew the weight of silence, and he knew that sometimes pressing too soon could break what was fragile. The girl needed to breathe, needed to remember she was alive before she could share any words. Her eyes flicked around the cabin, wary, darting to the door and then to him, as though expecting someone to come crashing in at any moment. Samuel stayed still, his broad shoulders relaxed, his hands folded loosely. He wanted her to see that he wasn't a threat, that she was safe here, even if the world outside wasn't. At last she spoke, her voice rough, dry, each word scraped raw. "My name is Eliza." The name came out like a confession. It hung in the air between them, something delicate, a thread of trust. Samuel nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Eliza," he repeated, the syllables heavy on his tongue after so many years of speaking to no one but cattle. "You're safe here." Her eyes shimmered, not with belief but with fear. She clutched the blanket tighter and shook her head, her voice rising. "No, I'm not safe. You're not safe. They'll come back. They always come back." Samuel felt the flicker of anger twist in his chest, not at her but at the faceless men who had done this. He leaned back in his chair, studying her bruises, the raw skin at her wrists, the way she flinched at the creak of the wood stove. She had lived through something unspeakable, and she carried it in her bones. He thought of his boy, gasping for breath in his final hours, his wife clinging to Samuel's hand as if his strength could hold her in the world. That same helpless terror flickered now in Eliza's eyes. "Listen," he said, his voice low, steady. "This ranch is a long way from town. No one comes here unless I let them. You've got nothing to fear tonight." Eliza pressed her lips together, her gaze flicking to the window. The plains stretched out endlessly beyond it, the darkness swallowing everything. "They'll find me," she whispered, almost to herself. "They always find us." Samuel tilted his head, the words catching his attention. "Us." There were others. But he didn't push. He saw how her shoulders shook beneath the blanket, how her knuckles whitened around the mug. Instead, he let the silence fall again, only broken by the pop of the fire. He rose and moved to the stove, scooping stew into a bowl, the smell of meat and vegetables filling the cabin. He set it in front of her, sliding the spoon toward her hand. She hesitated, then dipped it into the broth, her hands trembling so much she spilled some onto the table. She ate in small, careful bites, as though testing if it was real, if it would stay down. Samuel watched her, his jaw tight. Each spoonful she swallowed felt like a small victory. After a long while, she set the spoon down, her hand resting on the edge of the bowl. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, there was something other than fear. There was weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the body. "They took me," she said quietly. 2 days ago, from the road outside of town. I was walking to the market, and the wagon came. I thought they just wanted money. But they didn't. They tied me, beat me when I screamed. Said I'd fetch a price." Her voice broke, the last word splintering into a whisper. Samuel's fists clenched under the table, nails digging into his palms. He forced his voice to remain calm. "Not while you're here," he said. "They won't lay a hand on you again." Her lips trembled. "You don't understand. They'll come. Men like that don't stop. If they think I'm alive, they'll—" She cut herself off, shaking her head, pulling the blanket tighter. Samuel leaned forward, his voice firm now, a quiet thunder. "Let them come. They'll find a man waiting who has nothing left to lose. And that's the worst kind of man to cross." Her eyes widened slightly, searching his face, as if trying to measure whether he meant it. Slowly, she nodded, though fear still trembled in her gaze. She looked down at the bowl, then back up at him. "Why did you open it?" she asked suddenly, the question sharp, unexpected. "You could have walked away, pretended you never saw me. Most people would." Samuel sat back, his breath caught. He thought of the countless nights when the grief in his chest had felt like a sack tied tight around him, when he had begged silently for someone, anyone, to untie the rope and let him breathe. Again, no one had come, no one had opened it for him. He swallowed hard, his throat thick. "Because once," he said slowly, his voice like gravel, "I wished someone would have opened mine." Eliza's lips parted, her eyes glistening with sudden tears. She pressed a hand to her mouth, as though holding something back, but her shoulders shook. For the first time, the tears she shed weren't only out of fear. They were something else, something raw, something healing. Samuel looked away, giving her the dignity of crying without eyes upon her. The days that followed passed in a fragile rhythm. Samuel gave her chores, small ones at first, feeding the chickens, gathering eggs, sweeping the porch. It wasn't because he needed the help, it was because he wanted her to remember her hands could do something other than tremble. Eliza moved slowly at first, flinching at every sound, but with each day her steps grew steadier. Samuel found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about the land, about the horse that always tried to nip at him, about the storms that rolled across the plains like angry gods. He spoke of his boy too, in quiet fragments, and of his wife's laugh that he hadn't heard in half a decade. Eliza listened, her eyes soft, and sometimes she smiled faintly, as if the stories painted a world she wanted to step into. At night, when the fire burned low and the stars pressed close, Samuel sometimes caught her staring at the door, her body stiff, waiting for the sound of hooves. Each time, he rose and checked the windows, made sure the rifle was close at hand, and sat back down across from her. "Sleep," he would say quietly. "I'll keep watch." Slowly, the tightness in her shoulders eased. Slowly, the fear in her eyes began to soften. And one evening, when the sun dipped behind the horizon and painted the cabin in gold, Eliza looked at him with a question that seemed to reach deeper than words. "Do you really think we can stop them?" she asked. Samuel looked out the window, across the wide plains that had been his prison for years. Then he looked back at her, at the girl who had been stuffed in a sack and left for dead, yet still sat here breathing, alive, refusing to vanish. He saw in her eyes not only fear, but a spark of defiance. He nodded once, slow and certain. "I don't just think it," he said. "I know it." For the first time, her lips curved into the ghost of a smile, and in that flicker Samuel realized something had shifted. He had opened a sack that night on the road, but it wasn't just hers. It had been his too. And now, the air in his cabin felt lighter, as if for the first time in years, both of them could breathe.